By the time the last sack of flour ran out, Elijah Yates had already watched his fields turn to dust and his neighbors turn to ghosts. But in the back of his weather-beaten cabin, with nothing but boiled potatoes and a prayer, he found a way to make bread when the world said it was no longer possible. Before we dig into this story, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories of survival through grit and grace move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale might be even hungrier than this one. It started the way most endings did in those days, with silence. The wind had stopped for once, but the stillness wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that pressed on Elijah's chest as he stared at the last scoop of flour left in the burlap sack. He had rationed it longer than anyone else in the county, not because he had more, but because he needed less. The kids were gone now, sent off to Oklahoma to live with his wife's cousin. His wife Ruth had passed in 31, the same week the wheat gave up trying to grow. Elijah stood in his kitchen, what was left of it. The window panes had been replaced twice with whatever he could scavenge from the barn-warped glass from a lantern, a piece of broken mirror. Light came in, slanted and dim. The table, once polished oak, was pitted with years of knife work and neglect. On it sat the bowl, the same one Ruth had used. He could almost see her there, sleeves rolled up, dust on her cheeks, humming a hymn he hadn't heard since the radios went silent. The flour fell into the bowl like snow. He added water and salt, nothing more. No eggs, no butter, not even lard. Those were luxuries now. He mixed it with slow hands. There was no rush when you had nowhere to be, and nothing to look forward to. That bread baked hard and bitter. He chewed it anyway, tearing it in half and saving the rest for the next day. That night, he sat by the stove, just embers now, and stared into the dark. Hunger didn't bother him like it used to. What gnawed at him wasn't the emptiness in his belly, but the growing fear that he wouldn't find a way through this one. Every winter had its trick, but this year he had nothing left to trade, no chickens to sell, no neighbor to borrow from. Until the next morning, he went to boil the last of the potatoes. He'd saved a few, small and shriveled, from a failed second planting. As the steam rose from the pot, something old stirred in his mind, Ruth's voice. A memory, faint and fleeting. If the flour runs dry, mash the potatoes fine. The old folks used to stretch it with root and hope. He set the flour tin aside, didn't need it now. Something else had begun. The first loaf didn't rise. Elijah didn't expect it to. He mashed the potatoes in Ruth's bowl with the back of a spoon, sweat running down his neck though the cabin was near freezing. There was no science to it, only feeling. A bit of salt, a pinch of baking powder he'd found in the place. Cabinet behind the stove. The tin was rusted, the label barely legible, but it still smelled sharp, like something alive. He added a touch of the potato water, starchy and warm, and stirred until the mixture turned thick and sticky. Not dough, not quite, but close enough to believe in. He shaped it with calloused hands, the same hands that once gripped a plow, now gripping hope. Into the cast-iron skillet it went, and onto the stove it sat. He kept the fire low, watching the edges bubble, the crust darken. The smell, it wasn't bread exactly, but it was close enough to make his stomach growl for the first time in days. Elijah broke off a corner as soon as it cooled, burned his fingers, and didn't care. It was dense, a little sour, but warm, real. He ate the whole thing standing up, and then he sat down and cried. It wasn't just the food, it was the proof that he hadn't run out of everything. There was still something in him that could make do, make something, make bread. The idea was older than him, older than Ruth, even a whisper from back in the hills of Kentucky where her people came from. They'd used what they had. When flour was scarce, they turned to potatoes, or cornmeal, or even acorn mash. Not fancy, but it kept them alive. That night, Elijah wrote it down. Just a few lines on the back of a ledger page. Boiled potatoes, salt, old powder, mash it good, let it rest, fry it slow. It wasn't a recipe, it was a ritual. And over the next few weeks, he'd make that same bread again and again, refining it, testing, stretching, sometimes with a bit of onion if he found one. Sometimes with a splash of buttermilk a neighbor bartered for firewood. But always potatoes at the core. The yield from his winter crop wouldn't be enough to sell, but it would be enough to survive. Word started to spread. A traveler from down near Stinnett stopped in looking for feed and left with a piece of the strange bread. Said it tasted like a memory. Elijah just nodded. He didn't need credit. He needed the fire to stay lit and the dough to hold together one more time. Because winter wasn't done with them yet. The man came at dusk, coat stiff with frost and a limp that told of hard roads. Elijah saw him coming through the window, just a silhouette on the horizon line, hat low, one hand tucked under his arm like it was broken. By the time the knock came, Elijah had already poured what was left of the potato mash into the skillet. "Don't got feed," Elijah said before the door was halfway open. "Don't got coffee neither." The man nodded slowly. "Didn't come for trade." He stepped inside, boots caked in ice. He looked younger than Elijah had expected, but hollowed out, like so many were these days. Carved down to hunger and hard miles. "You Yates?" the man asked. Elijah blinked, surprised. "I am." The stranger rubbed his hands by the stove, careful not to ask for anything, careful not to assume. "Name's Cal. I passed through Blue Hollow last week. There's a woman there, sells biscuits for the train hands. Said she tasted something like bread come out of here. Said it was made without flour." Elijah didn't answer. Just turned back to the pan and flipped the dough. It hissed in the fatless iron. Steam curled toward the ceiling, rich and earthy. "I'm not asking for charity," Cal added. "I got a sack of dried beans I've been saving. And a harmonica, if music counts for anything still." Elijah reached behind him, pulled a second tin plate from the shelf. He cut the loaf in half, one part for Cal, one for himself. No butter, no jam, just warmth and the ghost of starch. They ate in silence, heads bowed like it was communion. After the meal, Cal told him about the trains that didn't come anymore. About families sleeping under railroad trestles, and kids begging outside grain silos. About mothers trading wedding rings for sacks of bran. None of it was news, but hearing it in a stranger's voice made it feel real again. "What's it made of?" Cal asked finally, gesturing to the bread. "Potatoes," Elijah said. "Salt, bit of old baking powder." Cal shook his head slowly, amazed. "Tastes like something from before." Elijah didn't answer. He was watching the stove, the way the embers glowed in the ash. By morning, Cal was gone. Left before sunrise, a note scratched in pencil on the table. "Took nothing, left the beans, told folks downriver you still got fire. Thank you for the warmth in every sense." The tin of beans sat where the bread had been. Elijah sat alone with his hands folded and the wind scratching at the walls. He hadn't meant to start anything. But the hunger was spreading faster than the dust. And if all he had to fight it with was boiled root and an old skillet, then so be it. He would keep baking. Not because it was enough, but because it was something. By the end of January, the smoke told the story before the space wind could. It rose in thin curls from Elijah's chimney, steady and constant, a signal more reliable than mail. Word had spread not in newspapers, but through whispers, wagon trails, and cold hands passed from one county to the next. Folks didn't ask for much anymore. They came with children, with sacks of turnips, or sometimes with nothing at all, but always they came with eyes that had forgotten what hope looked like. He started waking earlier, stoking the fire before dawn, boiling potatoes before the frost burned off the inside of the windows. Each batch of bread was mixed in Ruth's old bowl, now stained and worn like everything else he owned. He rationed salt like it was gold. The baking powder finally gave out, and he started using a little sour milk to coax the dough upward. It wasn't fluffy, but it was warm. The smell alone brought people to tears. A mother named Annie showed up with twin boys, no older than 5. She offered a bundle of kindling and a cracked button accordion. "We heard you were feeding folks," she said, eyes wide with the shame of asking. Elijah took the wood, nodded at the children, and handed them each a slice. The smallest boy took a bite, chewed slow, then looked up and whispered, "It tastes like Sunday." Elijah had to step outside and spit into the dust just to keep from crying. He kept records now. Not names, but trades. He wrote them on scraps of paper and nailed them to the wall. One loaf for shovel work, one for dried apples, one for a fiddle tune played at dusk. The walls of his cabin became a kind of ledger, not of money, but of dignity. Sometimes he caught himself looking toward the ridge, watching for riders, for men who might say he was hoarding or breaking some law about food distribution. But no one came to stop him. Not yet. One day, a preacher arrived, thin as a fence post, coat stitched from 3 different suits. "Saw the smoke," he said. "Figured the Lord might be at work in here." Elijah said nothing, just handed him a plate. The preacher took a bite, nodded slowly, then asked if he could leave a verse. "I don't need sermons," Elijah muttered. "No sermon," the preacher said, "just this." He pulled a scrap of paper from his coat and tacked it to the wall. "Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days." Elijah didn't argue. He let the bread rise slowly that night, and when it was done he wrapped the loaves in burlap and left one on the preacher's saddle, not out of faith, but out of muscle memory. Because sometimes survival looks a lot like grace. Spring came slow that year. The snow didn't melt so much as fade, giving way to a gray slush that soaked boots and made the dust beneath even heavier. The wind still came, but softer now, as if the plains had run out of rage. Elijah Yates stood at his window and watched the fields breathe again, bare and broken but alive in a way they hadn't been since before Ruth died. The bread still baked each morning. He'd gotten better at it. The sour milk trick turned to habit, and one of the travelers had left behind a packet of yeast, so old he thought it might be useless, but he stirred it into a batch on a gamble, and the dough doubled in size overnight. He laughed aloud when it happened, the sound cracking through the cabin like a shotgun. It was the first time his own voice had startled him in months. More people came. Not a flood, just a steady trickle, faces new and familiar, some with stories, some with silence. They left behind trinkets, seeds, one hand-forged hoe, a tattered book of psalms with pages missing. One child offered him a carved button in the shape of a dove. "Mama said you gave us bread," the boy whispered, "so I wanted to give you something that don't rot." Elijah kept it on the window ledge. By April, someone had scratched Yates bread into a rail post by the creek. He didn't know who, but he left it there. The days got warmer. The potatoes he'd planted late in winter began to break the soil, not many, not enough to feed a town, but enough to keep baking. It was never about plenty, it was always about just enough. One afternoon, while the bread cooled on the sill, Elijah sat with a pencil and the back of a feed sack and began to write. He wrote everything Ruth had once said, everything he'd learned since: how to boil the potatoes just long enough, how to mash them while warm, when to stir and when to let the dough rest in silence. He wrote not because he expected to pass it down, he had no children nearby, no kin, but because something in him said the recipe shouldn't vanish. At the top of the page he wrote, "Bread, when there's nothing left." He folded the paper and tucked it into Ruth's Bible. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon and the shadows stretched long, Elijah stepped outside with a warm loaf wrapped in cloth. He didn't know where he was going, just that he had more than he needed today. Down the road, he saw a man walking alone, coat thin, face bowed against the wind. Elijah raised the loaf and called out softly, "You eaten?" The man looked up. "Not in 2 days." Elijah handed him the bread without ceremony, as if it were a handshake. "You're not from here," the man said. "No one is," Elijah replied. The wind picked up, lifting the steam from the fresh loaf like a prayer. The man walked on. Elijah stood there for a moment longer, staring down the empty road, and for the first time in years he didn't feel alone. Not because the world had changed, but because he had built something that could hold against it. Not a house, not a legacy, just bread. And sometimes that was enough.